If you've still got Matthew 24, hold on to that because that's where we're going to be for much of the lesson. Early in the year 19 BC, in order to gain favour with the Jews, the king Herod the Great began building a new temple in Jerusalem. Said that 1,000 priests were trained as masons, and to provide a base for the building, blocks were used which were 1 metre high and up to 5 metres long. The main structure was finished in around 9 BC, so after about 10 years, but work on the overall complex lasted until AD 64, so the temple took 83 years to be completed. It was destroyed 6 years later. Around AD 30, in the week leading up to his arrest and his crucifixion, the disciples commented to Jesus about the temple and its magnificence. Now, Matthew just gives a basic report on this. Matthew 24, verse 1, Jesus left the temple area and was going on his way when his disciples came up to point out the temple buildings to him. But if you go to Mark and Luke's accounts, you'll see that the disciples were making a bit more of a comment than that. For instance, in Mark 13 and verse 1, as he was going out of the temple, one of his disciples said to him, "Teacher, look, what wonderful stones and what wonderful buildings." And then Luke's account over in Luke chapter 21 and verse 5 gives this. And whilst some were talking about the temple, that it was decorated with beautiful stones and vowed gifts, he said, and it goes on to say what Jesus said. But there's a comment about the magnificence of that new temple, and sometimes in books you'll see pictures of what it is thought to have looked like. And it was indeed a remarkable building. But Jesus, if you come back to Matthew 24 and verse 2, comments in a way that the disciples probably didn't expect. Matthew 24 verse 2, he responded and said to them, "Do you not see all these things? Truly I say to you, not one stone here will be left upon another which will not be torn down." Now by this time, the temple complex had been under construction for 49 years. And as we've seen, it was regarded as a magnificent sight, and yet Jesus' reply is to talk about its destruction. Now, naturally, the disciples wanted to know more about that, and they asked Jesus questions, and Matthew 24 and parallel passages is taken up with Jesus' explanation of what was going to happen. Jesus crosses over the Kidron Brook, the valley just outside the walls of Jerusalem, goes up on the Mount of Olives and sits there. So from that site you can look across to the temple and the city of Jerusalem. And 4 of his disciples came up to him. We are told there that it's Peter, James, John and Andrew, if you look at Mark 13. And they asked Jesus a number of questions relating to all of this. Now those questions and Jesus' answers are interpreted in a number of ways today. There are those who, because of the sort of language you read here in Matthew 24, think that the chapter consists of 2 parts. First, Jesus talks about the fall of Jerusalem that would come in AD 70. And then in the rest of the chapter, he talks about his final coming at the end of the world. And that's a fairly common view in the church. There are others who think that Jesus was speaking about the time when he would come to establish his so-called 1,000-year reign upon earth. And this view is known as premillennialism, and it is a very common view amongst denominations. I've recently written and taught a detailed series on this on Wednesday nights, showing that there are many problems with the premillennial doctrine. When you look at the Bible closely and you look at the various passages in context, you find that premillennialism just doesn't add up. Another view held by various ones is that Matthew 24 and parallel chapters in Mark and Luke are talking entirely about the fall of Jerusalem and its temple to the Romans in AD 70. If you look at the language that Jesus uses here, it's much the same as language used by the Old Testament prophets to indicate God's judgment upon nations and upon cities in Old Testament times. There's also the matter of timing of the events which are described here in Matthew 24. For instance, 24 and verse 34, Jesus says, "Truly I say to you," his four disciples, "this generation will not pass away until these things take place." And he's already said something similar back in Matthew 23 and verse 36, when he's talking to the scribes and the Pharisees, who he criticizes for their hypocrisy. He says, "Truly I say to you, all these things will come upon this generation." He says that to the scribes and the Pharisees. Now, some people, if they think that Jesus is talking about his final coming, will interpret Matthew 24 verse 34 to say that Jesus was speaking about Christians, and it will be at the end of the Christian era that these things will take place. But Jesus is not talking to Christians here, because Christianity hasn't yet been established. He's talking to people who were there with him, and indeed was talking to the scribes and the Pharisees before that, who were there at that time just prior to the establishment of Christianity. And in fact, remember, he's talking to 4 of his apostles, and if you look at the personal pronouns, like the word "you" that are used in verse 24, Jesus is saying to his apostles, you are going to see these things take place. It's going to happen in this generation, he says. So it's therefore my understanding, and others as well, that in Matthew 24, Jesus was talking of the fall of Jerusalem and the temple to the Roman army in AD 70. There would be a Jewish uprising in AD 66. The Roman-Jewish war would continue until AD 73. However, when Jesus made his prophecy in AD 30, he didn't give a date for when these events were going to take place. Matthew 24 verse 34 again, "Truly I say to you, this generation will not pass away until these things take place. Heaven and earth will pass away, but my words will not pass away. But about that day and hour no one knows, not even the angels of heaven, nor the Son, but the Father alone." Now, he's given a clue. He says it will take place in this generation, but he says, other than that, I am not going to give you a particular date. And because he wasn't giving a date for it, then many people were going to be taken by surprise. Verse 37 of Matthew 24, "For the coming of the Son of Man will be just like the days of Noah. For as in those days before the flood, they were eating and drinking, marrying and giving in marriage until the day that Noah entered the ark, and they did not understand until the flood came and took them all away, so will be the coming of the Son of Man." So many were going to be caught unready for these events. But even though Jesus did not give a specific date, he did tell the disciples that there were certain preparations that they could make, and then the disciples in turn could pass these things on to Christians once Christianity was established, which would be some weeks, let's see, seven or 8 weeks after Jesus is talking at this particular time. So have a look, for instance, at Matthew 24 and verse 42, sorry. Therefore be on the alert, for you do not know which day your Lord is coming. Now that word alert there means to keep awake, to watch, to be vigilant, to be watchful. In other words, be ready for this time. It will come. And keep it in mind. But here's the question, how were they to be ready? How were they to be on the alert? Well, there's several things that Jesus points out. For instance, Matthew 24 and verse 13, but the one who endures to the end is the one who will be saved. So one of the things that Jesus pointed out here was the need to stay faithful. Just as it says in Revelation chapter 2 and verse 10, be faithful unto death. Never give up, never quit. Furthermore, when this time comes that I'm talking about, get to safety. Jesus isn't giving a specific time, but he does give some clues for what to look out for. Matthew 24 verse 15. Therefore, when you see the abomination of desolation, which was spoken of through Daniel the prophet, standing in the holy place, let the reader understand, then those who are in Judea must flee to the mountains. Whoever is on the housetop must not go down to get things out of the house, and whoever is in the field must not turn back to get his cloak. In other words, when you see the danger signs, don't delay, get away. Now, if this was talking about Jesus' final coming, the idea of running to the mountains wouldn't make much sense. What is he talking about? Well, you've got the statement in verse 15, when you see the abomination of desolation. Now, that's a quote from the book of Daniel. There's several passages in Daniel 9 and 11 and even 12 which talk about these things. Luke's account gives us a bit more information here, which helps us to understand. In Luke chapter 21 and 20, but when you see Jerusalem surrounded by armies, then recognize that her desolation is near. So there was something to look out for. The Roman army temporarily besieged Jerusalem in AD 66, but then withdrew until it besieged Jerusalem again in AD 70. And in that Roman Jewish war, the Romans would basically start up in Galilee and would fight battles there and would work their way south. So there was going to be a warning of what was happening at the time. And so Christians were to get away to safety, and as far as history indicates, they did. The apostles passed on Jesus' message. And then there's also the message here to be ready for what is coming. Matthew 24 verse 42, therefore be on the alert, for you do not know which day your Lord is coming. But be sure of this, that if the head of the house had known at what time of night the thief was coming, he would have been on the alert and would not have allowed his house to be broken into. For this reason, you must be ready as well, for the Son of Man is coming at an hour when you do not think he will. So, again, the idea is be vigilant. One lunchtime years ago, when we were living up here at Bass Hill, I set out, as I did every day, to go and pick Lavinia up from work. We got back, the door was kicked in, and somebody had gone through the house turning stuff over, grabbing whatever they could find of any use to them. Now, if we'd have known that that was going to happen, obviously we'd have made some other arrangements. But we were caught by surprise and unprepared. Jesus is saying to his listeners, to his disciples there, be ready, be aware that these things are going to happen, and don't let yourself be caught out. And then there's a further message in verses 45, right down in fact to 51, saying, do God's will. Who then is the faithful and sensible slave who his master put in charge of his household slaves to give them their food at the proper time? Blessed is the slave whom his master finds so doing when he comes. Truly I say to you that he will put him in charge of all his possessions. You've got work to do for God. Get on, be doing that work. So Jesus was going to come in judgment on Jerusalem, just as God in Old Testament times had come in judgment on various cities and nations. And so the apostles and the Christians needed to understand that this was going to happen and prepare for it by staying faithful and withdrawing to safety when it did start happening, but meanwhile just be getting on with all that was involved in being a Christian. So that was all going to take place in the first century, AD 66 to AD 70. What's that got to do with us? I remember that back in the 1990s, and it may have been a bit earlier, that there was a teaching that spread through some of our Queensland congregations and some in northern New South Wales. It was a doctrine that was known under various names. It was called Kingism, named after Max King, who was one of the proponents of this idea. It was called realized eschatology, basically the idea that end things had been fulfilled. But the most simple description was the AD 70 theory. And in this view, the idea was that all these end time events, such as the return of Christ and judgment and so forth, were fulfilled in the fall of Jerusalem in the year AD 70, and we're not waiting for them to be fulfilled anymore. Now, I never believed that at the time, and I still don't believe it. Indeed, I was asked to speak on it in a lectureship at Blacktown almost 20 years ago, back in 2004. However, there are various passages in the New Testament that talk about the fall of Jerusalem, and I acknowledge that, but there are others that don't. There are other passages that are talking about the end of time and about the resurrection of the dead and so forth. And just as Christians in the first century were urged to be ready for Christ coming in judgment on Jerusalem, so Christians today, and for as long as time is, are warned to be ready for the coming of Jesus Christ for judgment upon the world. Let's go over to 1 Thessalonians chapter 4, beginning in verse 13. I think, yes, 1 Thessalonians 4, verse 13. Paul there talks about Christ's coming and the hope that it meant, particularly to Christians who had died. And he talks here about the fact that those Christians will be resurrected on the final day. And not only will those Christians be raised up, but other Christians will be raised up as well. And all of them will go to be with Christ. So there's that positive aspect of Christ's final coming in 1 Thessalonians 4. But if you go over to 2 Thessalonians chapter 1, again it talks about Christ's final coming, But it says there's a darker side to that, and that many people will not be ready for it. 2 Thessalonians 1, beginning in verse 6, for after all, it is only right for God to repay with affliction those who afflict you, and to give relief to you who are afflicted along with us, when the Lord Jesus will be revealed from heaven with his mighty angels in flaming fire, dealing out retribution to those who do not know God and to those who do not obey the gospel of our Lord Jesus. These people will pay the penalty of eternal destruction away from the presence of the Lord and from the glory of his power when he comes to be glorified among his saints on that day and to be marveled at amongst those who have believed. And so it continues on. So you've got this final coming of Jesus Christ, which will be a day of joy to faithful Christians, but a day of great fear to others. And so there's a need to be prepared for this day. And having talked about that day in 1 Thessalonians 4, Jesus goes on in 1 Thessalonians chapter 5 to talk about how Christians can prepare for that day. Chapter 5, verse 1, now, as to the periods and times, brothers and sisters, you have no need of anything to be written to you. For you yourselves know full well that the day of the Lord is coming just like a thief in the night. While they are saying peace and safety, then sudden destruction will come upon them like labor pains upon a pregnant woman, and they will not escape. So again, this will be unexpected for many. So what does Paul say to them? Well, chapter 5, verse 4, but you, brothers, are not in darkness, so that the day should overtake you like a thief. For you are all sons of light and sons of day. We are not of night nor of darkness. So then, let's not sleep as others do, but let's be alert and sober. So it goes on. There's two words that are used there. Alert, the same word as was used back in Matthew 24. It means to keep awake, to watch, to be vigilant, to be watchful, and then be sober. That's the idea of being in full possession of your senses. Not like a drunk person who really is not able to think clearly, but rather be sober, be self-controlled, be exercising self-restraint. And then also protect yourself with the various aspects of faith. You go on to 1 Thessalonians chapter 5 and verse 8 and following. But since we are of the day, let us be sober, having put on the breastplate of faith and love, and as a helmet the hope of salvation. For God has not destined us for wrath, but for obtaining salvation through our Lord Jesus Christ, who died for us, so that whether we are awake or asleep, in other words, alive or dead, we will live together with him. You notice there, back in verse 8, the breastplate of faith and love, and as the helmet, the hope of salvation. It's very similar language to what Paul uses in Ephesians chapter 6, beginning in verse 10. Armoring yourself with all the aspects of faith in Jesus. Ephesians 6 verse 10, finally, be strong in the Lord and in the strength of his might. Put on the full armor of God so that you will be able to stand firm against the schemes of the devil. For our struggle is not against flesh and blood, but against the rulers, against the powers, against the world forces of this darkness, against the spiritual forces of wickedness in the heavenlies. Therefore take up the full armor of God, so that you'll be able to resist on the evil day, and having done everything, to stand firm. Stand firm, therefore, having belted your waist with truth, and having put on the breastplate of righteousness, and having strapped on your feet the preparation of the gospel of peace, in addition to all taking up the shield of faith, with which you'll be able to extinguish all the flaming arrows of the evil one. And take the helmet of salvation and the sword of the Spirit, which is the word of God. So make use of all these spiritual blessings and helps and protections which God makes available to us. And then going back to 1 Thessalonians chapter 5, verse 11, help one another. Don't just think of yourself, but think of your fellow Christians. 1 Thessalonians 5:11, therefore encourage one another and build up one another, just as you also are doing. They were doing it already, and Paul says keep on doing that. Think of one another. Do what you can to help one another. My parents and my grandparents were alive in England during the Second World War, when many English cities, particularly London, were bombed heavily. And so the English through that time learned to be on the alert. And indeed there was defences keeping their ears open and watching the radar for attacks, and would sound a warning and the people could get to safety. And later in the war, 1944 I think it was, the Germans started using their rocket bombs, the V1s and the V2s. When the V2s came over, they would make a certain distinctive sound and people could hear them coming. But then at a certain point, the engine would cut out and the bomb would drop. And you knew that if that cut out overhead, you were in trouble. My father was blown across a room one day when one of those hit a street away. But the people learned to be vigilant. When they heard that noise, they were watching, they were listening, they were ready to do what it took to get to safety. And that's the way it is to be with us. This doesn't have to be a fearful event, the final coming. It can be a time of joy, to be resurrected, lifted up, to be with Christ. But if we're not ready, then yes, it is going to be a difficult time. In AD 30, the week leading up to his arrest, Jesus prophesied that a time of judgment lay ahead for that first century generation. 36 years later, the Roman-Jewish war broke out. Thousands were killed in the next few years as the Romans fought their way south, brought in extra troops. And then, during the siege of Jerusalem in AD 70, according to the historian Josephus, over 1 million people were killed. 97,000 Jews were taken prisoner. Now, you have to be careful with Josephus' figures, but nevertheless, it is said that at that time the streets ran red with blood. But it is also reported that Christians who had got the message that Jesus had given to the disciples recognized the signs of what was happening and did get to safety. And just as Jesus pointed to a time of judgment on Jerusalem, so he also points to a final time of judgment. Now, we haven't got a date for that. We don't know when it will happen. Many have tried to set dates. Some groups repeatedly have set dates and they've been wrong again and again and again. If I can adapt what a writer named Richard France said in the New Bible Commentary, our readiness for Jesus' coming lies not in speculation about when it will happen, but in always being prepared for it. And there was a song that used to be in the hymn books. It's not in the latest ones, unfortunately, but there was a song, Are You Ready? Are you ready? Just as the disciples were told to be ready for Christ's coming judgment on Jerusalem, Christians are told to be ready for Christ's coming judgment upon the world. We should be alert, watchful, vigilant. We should be self-controlled. We should maintain faith, hope, love. We should encourage one another. We should build up one another to be strong and faithful. As Jesus said to his followers in Matthew 24 and verse 13, but the one who endures to the end is the one who will be saved. Jesus would come in judgment on Jerusalem in AD 70, and Christians at that time needed to be prepared. Jesus will come again to bring salvation for some and judgment for others. And we today need to be prepared. And we do that by following this word and committing ourselves to what God has taught. Let's stand and sing.